Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Gabriel's YouTube channel. Today, we have a review of the Netflix film Horse Girl. This film was directed and written by Jeff Baena, and is also written by the main star of the film, Alison Brie. It's a bit of a unusual, funky film, to say the least. It premiered at Sundance Film Festival and already had a deal with Netflix, so in February it came out for everyone to see, which is pretty rare for a Sundance film. Usually they go to Sundance to get the opportunity to get distribution, but here it was already set in stone. So, let's take a look in the car, back in the drive-thru. We're going to take a look at this film, and we're going to especially take a look at the way that it was written. Because in a very unusual, unorthodox way, it was written with a very detailed outline in the screenplay. However, the dialogue itself was mainly improvised. Now, because there was such an elaborate outline for the film, there wasn't a lot of wiggle room for the improvisation, but I still think it's an important thing to talk about in this particular moment in the review. And I think it kind of comes through where there are a couple moments where some of the less experienced and less talented actors, no offense of course, they kind of trail off. And I think that becomes particularly prevalent at the beginning, like 2/3 of the film, before things really start to pick up at the end. Because most of this film, unfortunately, is very boring. It doesn't really feel like it's going anywhere, and there's really not much to cling on to in the first hour of the film. I hate to sound so nihilistic about it, but it really is kind of a snore. It's very cookie cutter, cut and paste, awkward, romantic comedy, and the comedy doesn't really hit, and neither does the romance, because it all just comes out so stinted and awkward to watch. And in some cases that can be quirky in a nice way, but for some weird reason with this movie, it just comes off kind of unusual and kind of weird. And not the good weird. But nevertheless, the scenes kind of work their way like this for a while, but then at the end, when the plot really starts to pick up and things start to get a little more unusual and more interesting, then things start to look good. In terms of the visuals, this is really where the film starts to pick up too, because for the most part, it's a very boringly shot film. It's nothing really zesty or interesting when it comes to the cinematography or the lighting or any of that jazz for the majority of the film. But by the end, there's a particular montage in general at the end where we don't know whether or not it's real or not, that comes off like a whole different movie. It's incredibly interesting, and there's some really fun visual elements that make things really interesting in terms of the special effects that they use and some of the practical effects. It's very interesting. It's a lot more interesting than the rest of the movie. In terms of the performances, I have to give a nod to Alison Brie. She obviously commits a whole lot to this role, considering she wrote half the film, presumably, and then the other half was the director, Jeff Baena. Have to assume that that she would show up here, and she absolutely did. It was really, honestly, probably the best part of the film was her consistent and kind of powerful performance in a lot of ways. She really commits a lot to the role, physically and mentally, I'm sure. I've heard that this is a very personal role for her in terms of what the character goes through on in a mental way, and all power to her, because she definitely showed up with this film, and I definitely think it's one of the more crowning moments of the film for me. Unfortunately, the directing leaves a lot to be desired, and so does the visual style. So it kind of bogs down a lot of the effort that she's putting into the film. Not to say that the rest of the actors aren't, giving it their all or anything like that. I think everybody does put in a decent performance. It's just nothing to really raise my grade in any way, you know, besides the exceptional Alison Brie leading role. Also, got to take into account the musical score with this one. It's just, I don't know what it what it is about the films that I'm reviewing, but this was just an abysmal score. I don't remember 99% of it, and the only 1% that I do remember is just kind of like this really unusual droning noise that I'm guessing was supposed to play into more of the bizarre elements of the film. However, it's just annoying. It's just unnecessarily aggravating to the ears more than anything. And I'm sure that was the plan, but it doesn't it's not necessary to have these kind of really drony and under the skin but worse sound design. It's very bizarre. And the sound design in general kind of lost its luster in that way, because it felt like the music was just brought in at inappropriate times, and the music itself just did not feel like it worked with the rest of the movie in general. So yeah, that one's not great either. But let's talk about the costumes now. And I don't always talk about the costumes, but I really wanted to mention it here because I was really confused about the costumes in a lot of this film. The costumes, I don't know what time period they're supposed to be referencing or what the idea was with them, because they're very like vintagey, and even for characters that aren't meant to look like they have a vintage style, it just comes across very, very bizarre and like a really weird throwback that kind of has nothing to do with the rest of the film. So I know the film kind of plays with time, not to expose any of the spoilery elements, but you know, there is an element of time that's played around throughout most of the film, and maybe it was an homage to that, but it confused me more than anything else, in the sense that I had no idea what time period this movie was supposed to be in, and yeah, nothing really helped. It all felt very vintagey in an otherwise modern story. So I don't really know exactly what they were going for. Maybe it was as a homage to the more time warping elements of the story. Just came across as confusing to me. You know, I think that's the big moral of the story for most of this film, is that a lot of the choices that were made, although presumably very deliberate, just kind of ended up confusing me and muddling the message and the core of the film as a whole to me. It's very bizarre. So with that all being said, let's go into the scores here. First, we're going to start with directing. And I think the directing is kind of just, you know, it doesn't really add a lot. And, you know, it's clear that Jeff Baena had a very distinct vision for this film. I don't really think what he added particularly increased the effectiveness of the film or the story in any way. So I'm going to give the directing a 10 out of 20. You know, very, very middle ground. I don't feel like he destroyed the film or anything like that, but he definitely did not increase the effectiveness in any way. In terms of the acting, I would give it a 13 out of 20. I think Alison Brie carries the acting performances in this film, while everybody else is definitely on a whole nother tier in the film. I feel like Alison Brie really brings it, while everybody else kind of does their job. You know, just kind of chilling over in the skinny end of the pool, you know. But Alison Brie is over there swimming in the going out of the shallows into the deep end. She's doing all kinds of dives and crazy moves, while everybody else is chilling with their feet in, just kind of kicking around. That's a very elaborate way of saying that that's a 13 out of 10 for me. The visual style. Like I said, for most of the film, it's pretty lackluster and boring. The film actually does a weird thing. I didn't mention this before, but the visual style does this weird thing where it kind of references like 70s style films. There's a lot of push-in zooms and zooms out to characters' faces and bodies. That was another weird vintage element that I liked. I just did not understand why it was there at all. It's just another random vintage thing that they added that I don't really get. It could very well just be an homage to, you know, filmmakers like Brian De Palma, who really characterized that style of zooming for their films. I'm not really sure, but it was nice, sort of. And then later on in the film, when the visuals really start to make things interesting, there were a couple of practical effect elements and things like that towards the end that were really cool and very inventive. I just wish that more of the film had that, because for the most part it's pretty wooden. So I'm gonna give the visual style a 12 out of 20. Moving on with the writing, it's also kind of middle of the road like the directing. I'm gonna give the writing a 10 out of 20. It was an interesting direction that they went with the improv heavy style, with a detailed outline rather than distinct dialogue for the characters. And while I think sometimes it works, it's kind of rare. It's rare that it works the way that I think was intended. Because for the most part, dialogue and conversations between characters just kind of linger, and there's really no character that develops in there or anything like that. It takes a little while to figure out everybody, just because, you know, the dialogue isn't really unveiling anything to us. So it takes a little while for things to get going in that way, you know, similar to the visuals. So that's the writing. And last but not least, we have the editing, which is kind of barren, and I thought that the audio-based sound design editing of the film was kind of lackluster. So that definitely brought the points down. And besides that, the editing was kind of invisible. You know, it wasn't anything particularly noteworthy or crazy, but it wasn't great either. So I'm going to give it a nice middle of the road, once again, a 10 out of 20 for the editing. And put all those bad boys together, and I'm going to give Horse Girl a 55 out of 100. Or if we're going by our 5-star scale, a 2.5 star out of 5. You know, it's a very unusual, very overly quirky Netflix film that I would certainly recommend for the Alison Brie performance, and, you know, maybe stay at the end for the visuals. I mean, I wouldn't blame you if you start looking at your phone for the first hour or so, but there are definitely some elements that are interesting for sure. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed the review. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed, or if you have any constructive criticism for me or the channel, and I'll see you in the next review. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day.